There have been so many different opinions out there about the best thing to do. How will we respond? What is it that we want to be known for in the midst of this difficult time? This sermon about serving has been written 3 different times this week as new things came out or new things kicked me in the heart, wondering what does it look like to be a servant of Jesus Christ in the midst of a pandemic? Are we the first responders who don't even have enough masks because of the frightened public buying them all up to run headfirst into the scary situation? Are we called to quarantine ourselves and to be cut off, even though we are social creatures and it goes against every fiber in our being to do that? However we answer those questions, at some point we have to put a little caveat with that to say, what would Jesus have us do? That's a little extra letters for the bracelet, but it's really important that we ask that question of ourselves. There is a balance of being safe, and there is a balance of loving neighbor as self that does have a component of keeping ourselves off and keeping ourselves away from others. Because we could be carriers of this virus and not even know it and spread it to someone that it makes an incredibly problematic health issue for. So as we look through some of these ideas, and then we talk about today is serve, how do we do that? What does that look like? Well, the things that we've already learned about worship, we don't stop worshiping because a virus has hit. Whether it is by ourselves, and this sermon will be put online for those who couldn't be here. United Methodist Church of the Resurrection in Leawood, Kansas has an amazing worship service that is on the internet every Sunday. And I think they even have a weekly one too. There are many options for us to still be in somewhat of a secluded idea and still worship. We can still study. We can still study in the midst of this difficult time. We can still open our Bibles. We can still read through the information that's in the handout from the bulletin. We can still do those things. But how do we serve? How do we respond to that call to be servants of Christ, lovers of neighbor? Well, we keep serving. It may be in a different environment. It may be a smaller circle, but we keep serving. I thought about, as we were trying to figure out what to do for dinner the other day, I was reading through an email. I don't know about you, but I've gotten an email from everybody I've ever bought something from telling me what their position on the coronavirus is. Dear Matthew, in case you were thinking about ordering from Pizza Hut, here's what our CEO has to say. Well, oddly enough, he had something very interesting. Pizza Hut now has a thing where if you order a pizza for them, you can choose for that. You can prepay, and you can choose for them just to leave it at your door. They'll sit it down by the door, and they'll walk away. So you don't have to have any contact with that person in case you're worried about that, or if they're worried about that for their drivers. And I thought, has there ever been a better model for a United Methodist casserole drop-off ministry than what Pizza Hut's doing? We were created for such a time as this, friends. If we've got somebody in need of food, we can be that drop-off porch person that sends food to someone who can't get out to find some for themselves. We can still serve, and oh, how fun that would be, right? Yeah, we can do that. What would Jesus do during this outbreak? I've heard people say, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus be doing? How about what is Jesus doing? We don't have to pretend like Jesus is some faraway place and he's just watching this on TV screens remotely too because he's in self-quarantine. God is not in quarantine, friends. In the midst of this, if we are secluded, God is not. God is still working. And God is the most creative force in this universe because God created the universe. God works within us and through us. Even though we are limited, God will still come to full fruition in love. We can still do things even in a limited capacity. And there is a lesson in that although I'm not glad Corona is here, I am so very thankful that we are finally understanding that in our collective weaknesses and limitation, God is still strong. And we are still able to serve. We can still get the job done. We can still love one another as Christ loved us, even in the midst of all the uncertainty. And if the church waffles in uncertainty at such a time as this, then who is left? We can be calculated. We can still make good, sound, discerned choices for the safety of our congregation, but we do not stop serving, no matter what. During World War II, England needed to increase its production of coal. And so Winston Churchill called together labor leaders to enlist their support, and at the end of his presentation, he asked them to picture in their minds a parade which he knew would be held in Piccadilly Circus after the war. First, he said, would come the sailors who'd kept the vital sea lanes open. Then would come the soldiers who had come home from Dunkirk and then gone on to defeat Rommel in Africa. Then would come some pilots who had driven the Luftwaffe from the skies over London. Last of all, he said, would come a long line of sweat-stained, soot-streaked men in miners' caps. Someone would cry from the crowd, "And where were you during the critical days of our struggle?" they would ask. And from 10,000 throats would come the answer, "We were deep in the earth with our faces to the coal." We were deep in the earth with our faces to the coal. What does it look like for the church to have its faces to the coal? What does it look like to understand that in this time the world is watching us? How do we serve? How do we look for those small little things, like Desmond Tutu said, the small little things when they are all added up change the world? What are the small little things that you could be doing even in a restricted capacity to keep your face to the coal? Say, "Oh, I can't do this anymore. I shouldn't be doing that. That's a higher risk to myself and to others." Fine. What's something else? What's something new that you could do to serve? What does it look like for us to have our faces to the coal? What does it look like to keep track of one another, to look in on one another, to look in on our cul-de-sac neighbors or the people just so many houses across and behind and around? For such a time as this, we understand that we don't even really know our neighbors, let alone work to serve and to love our neighbor. Christ calls us to be servants, to help love and sustain others. How can you love and sustain your neighbors? If you're confined, does a neighbor need your assistance? Serving is so important for us as human beings. We get really obsessed with sin in our faith. We talk about this kind of sin or that kind of sin, and is this kind of sin really bad or is that kind of sin not as bad? And we just have all these categories and we talk about all the different ways that sin is part of the human experience. But I will tell you this, we can kind of just cut to the quick and say that for something to really be sinful, it has to be at its root selfish. If you just look at the story we're given about the Garden of Eden, that the first temptation and giving into it was that I know better than God selfishness, that I am not going to do this because I know better selfishness. Think about any sin, think about anything sinful, and at some point there was a decision made that was selfish. Serving pushes back on our natural tendency to be selfish. Serving others, loving others. What's the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, your strength, and your neighbor as yourself. What? Take yourself out of yourself as a priority. Make God number one. God will teach you how to love your neighbor. And in the course of all that, it will dawn on you that you also suddenly love yourself at a level you never thought possible. To push back against sin in our world, we need to serve and love our neighbors. How do our decisions that we make, Is there some kind of thing we can use to help us make choices? The founder of Methodism really made it easy for us. He had 3 really simple rules, and we try our best to follow those. We've talked about them many times, but it's do no harm. Is what I'm about to do going to hurt someone? If it is, I shouldn't do it. 2, you can't just constantly be hands off and just try not to hurt people. Well, I didn't hurt that one. Oh, I didn't hurt that one. You also then, rule 2 is do good. So you work your hardest not to even accidentally harm someone, and then you proactively help someone. You do no harm, and you do good. And then in the midst of that, to kind of help you understand why you're doing that, Wesley said, keep to the ordinances of your faith. Keep to the ordinances of your faith. It's the walk. It's the essential practices. Serve, love, study the scriptures, participate in the sacraments. Do what you can do to continue to grow in your faith. And then you'll have that energy that's needed to go out and to actively do no harm, to do good. What does that look like for us in the midst of what we're going through as individuals, as families, as communities, as a church? What does it look like to say, here's something that's harmful that we shouldn't do, or here's something that's good that we should do? Are we asking those questions, not just of ourselves, but of our congregation? Those are important. Our bishop has a tagline. I believe it is the essence of his ministry and leadership here in the Indiana Conference. Bishop Trimble always says, be encouraged. Be encouraged. And now at a time like this, it's really comforting to hear him say those words. And he's put out a lot of great communications to support congregations, to support us, to support clergy, district superintendents, cabinet, staff. He is embodying that non-anxious presence. Be encouraged. Here's something I want to propose to you. How many of you love March Madness? Raise your hands. Those are hands that have a lot of time on them now. Whether or not you participated in the bracket challenges and all the time that it took to select those teams, maybe for some it didn't take time at all, it's just fun, So maybe for some of you it took some serious time and thought, maybe even prayer, I don't know. But just with the games themselves not being on, with no NBA games, with no spring training, there's a lot of time available now. Whatever will you do with it? I have an idea. Let's follow in our bishop's example and encourage people. How much time would you have spent in March Madness? And can you now use that time that you have and not just fill it up with other silliness? I do love March Madness. It's not silliness, I know. Could you write letters? Could you send emails to hospital staff? Could you do something for police or fire departments? First responders? Who are the people right now that are the least encouraged in our community because of what is happening? I think store managers at Kroger and Meijer could probably use some encouragement right now. Right? So, friends, if the church, if the Christians aren't going to be the encouragers, who's going to do it? That's my question. And I'm just saying, since we got all this time on our hands, why not be encouragers? Why not be find the most creative way to encourage someone and share it with us. Let us know what you did. Let's see if we can be competitive in a sacred way of outdoing one another in righteousness for the sake of Jesus Christ. Let's do it. Let's make a difference. Because even if for health reasons or concern reasons or whatever reasons, you're stuck at home or within your little neck of the woods, you can still be an encourager. Doesn't cost anything to send an email. Doesn't cost anything to make a phone call. But time, right? So you can be an encourager. Find a creative way that works within your gifts and your strengths to be an encourager of someone else. Lift them up. We are supposed to be bearers of one another's burdens. What a better example of doing that than to just say, hey, you know what? I am sure this is not a fun time for you. So I wanted you to know I'm praying for you and I appreciate what you're doing. That's it. That's it. The great violinist Niccolo Paganini willed his marvelous violin to the city of Genoa on condition, this is the only condition, that it was never, ever played. The wood of such an instrument, while used and handled, wears only slightly, but once it's set aside, it begins to decay. So Paganini's lovely violin has today become worm-eaten and useless, except as a relic that once produced beautiful music. A Christian's unwillingness to serve may soon destroy their capacity for usefulness. Think of that for a second. If we're not people who are actively serving and loving neighbor, we're just not doing what it is that Ephesians tells us that we're wired to do. Remember that, what we talked about? We were made for this. We are created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand to be our way of life. You were made for such a time as this, to be a servant, to be someone who would bear the grace and peace and hope and love of Jesus Christ to a world that needs encouragement and that needs to take a step back away from the fear trough. There is nothing wrong with being prepared. There is nothing wrong with being ready. But we've gone off the deep end as a society. And I think the church would be a wonderful, peaceful, non-anxious presence to kind of pull some of that back. And I know, and I've seen some of you do that same kind of amazing ministry in the time I've been your pastor. And I believe in you. And I know you can do it. So, don't use COVID as an excuse to become lazy in your faith. No one will blame you, right? So it's a real easy excuse. Well, coronavirus, I was going to read my Bible, but, I don't know who touched it last, so, coronavirus. Don't want to expose anybody, my Bible, right? It's not an excuse to stop practicing. If you think about all the pandemics and all of the crisis that have existed over the centuries, how did the church respond to those? The Christian never uses the world's circumstances as an excuse to step back and stop serving. The Christian uses the fear of the world and it pushes back, and it presses up against it, and it pushes back in the name of love. How will you balance safety with service in a time such as this? How will you balance safety, because that's important, and service, which is important? Prayerfully discerning your way on this walk of faith, I have faith in you, and I know you'll do it. And together, all our little things with our faces pressed against the coal just might start something amazing. It just might start something amazing. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.